The scorching sun beat down mercilessly on the red sandstone canyon as Gideon Nash pressed his back against the rough stone wall, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird desperately seeking escape. 3 armed men circled him with the predatory patience of wolves cornering wounded prey, their faces twisted with the kind of cruel anticipation that came from too much whiskey, too little conscience, and far too many miles from anything resembling civilization. "Well, well," sneered the leader, a grizzled man with tobacco-stained teeth and dead eyes that had seen too much violence and enjoyed every moment of it. "Look what we got ourselves here, boys. A lost little lamb far from his flock and bleeding for mercy." Gideon's throat felt like sandpaper as he watched the man's weathered fingers caress the trigger of his rifle, with the loving attention another man might give to a woman's skin. At 28 years old, and barely 5 feet 6 inches tall, with the lean build of someone who spent more time bent over surveying equipment than wielding weapons, Gideon knew he had about as much chance against these 3 seasoned killers as a candle flame had against a hurricane wind. The canyon walls seemed to press in around them, trapping the oppressive heat, along with the stench of unwashed bodies, stale whiskey, and the metallic tang of gunpowder that clung to the men like an invisible shroud. Somewhere high above, a hawk circled on the thermals, its cry echoing off the stone walls like a funeral dirge. "Please," Gideon managed to croak, hating the tremor in his voice, but unable to suppress it. The word came out as barely more than a whisper, lost in the vastness of the canyon. "I don't have much money, but you can take what I've got. My surveying equipment, my horse, take it all." The second man, younger but no less vicious than his leader, laughed harshly. The sound bounced off the canyon walls like breaking glass. "Oh, we'll take it all right, pretty boy. Question is what else we gonna take before we're done with you?" His eyes glittered with malice that made Gideon's skin crawl as he stepped closer, the barrel of his gun now mere inches from Gideon's chest. The third man, silent until now, spat a stream of tobacco juice that splattered against the red stone near Gideon's boots. "Been a long time since we had us some real entertainment," he said in a voice like gravel grinding against bone. "City boy like you probably ain't never seen what we can do to a man when we put our minds to it." Gideon closed his eyes, thinking of his mother back in St. Louis with her gentle hands and worried smile, wondering if anyone would ever find his body in this godforsaken place. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent years mapping the wilderness, creating detailed charts of territories that most civilized people would never see. And now he would become just another unmarked grave in the vastness he had dedicated his life to understanding. The sound of spurs jingling against stone grew closer. Gideon could smell the leader's rancid breath, feel the heat radiating from his unwashed body. This was it then. This was how Gideon Nash's unremarkable life would end, not with the quiet dignity he had always imagined, but with terror and pain in a nameless canyon under a pitiless sun. That's when she appeared. One moment the men were dividing up the meager contents of his saddlebags with greedy hands, arguing over who would get his compass and who would take his boots. The next, their leader was on the ground, clutching his shattered wrist and howling like a wounded animal. His rifle lay in pieces against the canyon wall, the wooden stock splintered beyond recognition and the metal barrel bent at an impossible angle. The woman who had materialized from the shadows moved with a fluid grace that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Nearly 6 feet tall, with bronze skin that gleamed like polished copper in the harsh sunlight, she was everything Gideon had never imagined a woman could be. Her long black hair was braided with small bones and eagle feathers that caught the light as she moved, and her buckskin dress, decorated with intricate beadwork, revealed arms corded with muscle that spoke of years wielding weapons and surviving in the harsh wilderness. She fought with a precision and economy of motion that left Gideon breathless and terrified in equal measure. Her movements were like a deadly dance, each strike calculated for maximum effect. Her fist connected with the second man's jaw with a sound like breaking timber, and he dropped like a stone, his gun flying from nerveless fingers to clatter against the canyon floor. When the third man tried to flee, scrambling over the rocky ground with panic-driven desperation, she caught him by the collar with one hand and hurled him face first into the dirt with casual ease that spoke of strength far beyond what her lean frame suggested possible. Within minutes that felt like hours, all three men were stumbling away, bleeding and cursing, leaving behind their weapons and what remained of their dignity. Their threats and bluster had evaporated like morning mist, replaced by the desperate urgency of prey that had suddenly found itself face to face with an apex predator. The canyon fell silent, except for the whisper of wind through stone and Gideon's labored breathing. Even the hawk above seemed to have paused in its circling, as if nature itself was holding its breath in the aftermath of such sudden, decisive violence. Gideon stared up at his savior, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. She stood over him like some ancient goddess of war, her chest rising and falling with controlled breaths that spoke of perfect physical conditioning. Not a single strand of her magnificent hair was out of place, and there wasn't even a speck of dust on her buckskin dress, despite the violence she had just unleashed. The morning sun created a golden halo around her imposing frame, and for a moment that stretched into eternity, Gideon forgot how to breathe. She was beautiful in the way that storms were beautiful, magnificent, terrifying, and absolutely capable of destroying everything in their path. "You hurt?" she asked, her voice deeper than most men's, but unmistakably feminine, in a way that made his stomach flutter with unfamiliar sensations. There was something almost musical about her accent, a cadence that spoke of a language far older than English. Gideon shook his head, still unable to find his voice. The simple gesture made his vision swim slightly, whether from shock dehydration or the intensity of her gaze, he couldn't say. She extended a hand to help him up, and when their fingers touched, electricity shot through his entire body like lightning striking dry earth. Her palm was calloused from years of hard living, but her touch carried a surprising gentleness that seemed at odds with the violence she had just displayed. The contrast was so unexpected that it made his knees weak. Standing next to her, Gideon felt like a child beside a mountain. She was everything he wasn't: tall, powerful, confident, dangerous. The kind of woman who could break him in half without breaking a sweat, who moved through the world with the absolute certainty of someone who had never doubted their place in it. And somehow, that thought both terrified and excited him in ways he couldn't begin to understand. "Why?" he finally managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. The words seemed to echo in the vastness of the canyon. "Why help me?" Her obsidian eyes studied his face with an intensity that made him feel exposed, as if she could see straight through to his soul and catalog every fear, every hope, every secret shame he had ever carried. Then slowly her lips curved into a smile that made his pulse race with something that definitely wasn't gratitude. "Maybe I like protecting things that need protecting," she said softly, her words carrying an undercurrent he couldn't quite decipher. The way she looked at him, not with pity or dismissal like most people, but with genuine interest, as if he were a puzzle worth solving, made heat rise in his cheeks. All his life, people had looked right through him, seeing only the small, forgettable surveyor who measured land for the railroad. Shopkeepers barely acknowledged him. Women smiled politely and looked elsewhere. Men dismissed him with a glance, but when her gaze traveled over his lean frame, lingering on details he had never considered worthy of attention, it felt different. It felt like recognition, like seeing, like mattering. "I'm not completely helpless," he said, trying to inject some pride into his voice, despite the evidence to the contrary that lay scattered around them in the form of abandoned weapons and his own obvious terror. She laughed, a rich sound that echoed off the canyon walls like music. "No, you survived those 3 longer than most would have. Took them almost 5 minutes to work up the courage to actually hurt you. That's something, I suppose." The observation was matter of fact rather than mocking. but it still made Gideon's face burn with embarrassment. "I'm not a fighter," he admitted. "Fighting isn't the only kind of strength," she replied, tilting her head slightly as she continued to study him. "What's a railroad man doing so far from civilization anyway?" Gideon's face burned at being so easily identified, but he straightened his shoulders with what dignity he could muster. "I'm a surveyor, mapping territories for the Transcontinental Railroad." The moment the words left his mouth, he saw her expression change. The amusement faded, replaced by something harder and more complex, disappointment perhaps, or anger, or something that might have been grief. "Railroad." She repeated the word, tasting bitter on her tongue. "The iron snake that cuts through the earth, destroying everything in its path." The disapproval in her voice should have warned him to back down, to apologize, maybe even to run, while she was still in a benevolent mood. Instead, Gideon found himself stepping closer, drawn by something he couldn't name, perhaps the way she looked at him, as if his answer actually mattered, as if his words carried weight. "Maybe so," he said quietly. "But it also brings medicine to remote towns, connects families separated by distance, carries food to places where people would otherwise starve. It brings newsmail hope." She stopped moving and faced him directly. This close, he could see flecks of amber in her dark eyes, could smell the sage and wood smoke that clung to her skin like an invisible shroud. Her presence was overwhelming, not just her physical size, though his head barely reached her chin, but something more fundamental. She occupied space the way mountains did, with absolute certainty and undeniable presence. "Pretty words," she said thoughtfully, and for a moment he thought she might be genuinely considering his perspective. "You measure land that was never yours to measure for a railroad that will bring soldiers and settlers to destroy what little remains of my people's world. And you attack men who might have families, who might just be trying to make an honest living." He shot back, surprised by his own boldness. The words were out before he could stop them, and immediately he regretted them, certain he had just signed his own death warrant. Her eyebrows rose dangerously, and for a terrifying moment, Gideon thought she might strike him down where he stood. The silence stretched between them like a drawn bowstring, heavy with potential violence. Instead, her smile widened, revealing white teeth that looked sharp enough to tear flesh. "You have fire in you, little surveyor," she said, and the way she pronounced "little" made warmth spread through his chest like whiskey on an empty stomach. "I didn't expect that." The word "little" should have stung, it always had, before a constant reminder of everything he wasn't, everything he could never be. But when it rolled off her tongue, it sounded almost affectionate, like an endearment between lovers, rather than an insult between strangers. "My name is Gideon," he said quietly, offering the only thing of value he had left. "Gideon Nash." "Ayanna," she replied somehow, making his plain English name sound exotic in return. The syllables of her name seemed to linger in the air between them, like an incantation. They stood there in the growing heat of the day, two people from different worlds who should have been enemies. The silence stretched between them thick with possibility, and an undercurrent of danger that made the air itself seem to vibrate with potential energy. As the moments passed, Gideon found himself studying her with growing fascination. There was something almost hypnotic about the way she carried herself, of the confident set of her shoulders, the graceful economy of her movements, the way her eyes seemed to catalog every detail of their surroundings, even as she focused on him. She was a predator, yes, but also something more complex. There was intelligence in her gaze, a depth that spoke of experiences far beyond anything he could imagine. And beneath the warrior's exterior, he glimpsed something that might have been weariness, the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who had been fighting for so long, they had almost forgotten what they were fighting for. "How long have you been alone out here?" He heard himself ask the question, emerging from some deep well of empathy he hadn't known he possessed. Something flickered across her features, Surprised perhaps that he had seen past the surface, that he had looked beyond the obvious strength and danger to notice the isolation beneath. Long enough to forget what it feels like to have someone worry about the answer to that question. She said, and there was a vulnerability in her voice that made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to build. This powerful, dangerous woman who had just saved his life looked in that moment almost fragile, not physically, never that, but emotionally. As if she had grown so accustomed to being seen as a weapon that she had forgotten what it felt like to be seen as a person. I'm worried about it. Gideon said simply, and the truth of the words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise her. She stared at him for a long moment, and he could see her trying to decide whether his concern was genuine or simply another form of manipulation. Finally, something in her expression softened. 2 years, she said quietly. 2 years since I left my people. 2 years of running, hiding, fighting. Why did you leave? The question seemed to hit her like a physical blow. Her jaw tightened, and for a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Because I got tired of being their weapon, she said finally. Tired of seducing white soldiers, learning their secrets, then watching my brother cut their throats in the dark. Tired of the endless cycle of blood and revenge. The revelation hit Gideon like a physical blow. He had suspected there was more to her story, but the reality was worse than anything he had imagined. She wasn't just a warrior, she was an assassin, a spy, a killer who had turned her back on everything she had ever known. How many? He asked quietly, not sure he wanted to know the answer. Too many. Her voice was barely audible. Men who trusted me, who thought I cared for them. Good men and bad men alike. It stopped mattering after a while. The pain in her voice was so raw, so genuine, that it made his heart ache. Whatever she had done, whatever sins she carried the weight of them, was crushing her. And now both sides want you dead, he said, understanding beginning to dawn. My people see me as a traitor. The white soldiers see me as a monster. There's no place in this world for someone like me. There could be. The words were out before he could stop them, and she looked at him as if he had spoken in a foreign language. Where? She asked, and there was so much naked hope in the question that it broke his heart. I don't know, he admitted, but somewhere big enough for second chances. The canyon fell silent around them, and in that silence, something shifted between them. The air seemed to thicken with possibility, with the weight of unspoken thoughts and unnamed desires. Finally, his courage, or perhaps his stupidity, reached its breaking point. The question that had been building inside him since the moment she touched his hand tumbled from his lips before he could stop it. What happens if I touch you? The words seemed to echo in the canyon, silence bouncing off the stone walls and hanging in the air between them like a challenge. Ayana's smile didn't waver, but something shifted in her obsidian eyes, something predatory and wild that made every nerve in his body come alive with electric anticipation. Interesting question from such a small man. She murmured, stepping close enough that her body heat radiated against his skin like warmth from a campfire. The scent of her filled his senses, sage and leather and wood smoke. But underneath it all, something indefinably feminine that made his head spin. He could see the pulse beating at the base of her throat, could count the small scars that marked her bronze skin like a map of battles fought and survived. She was close enough now that he could feel her breath on his face, could see the way her pupils dilated slightly as she looked at him. The moment stretched between them, like a taut wire vibrating with tension and possibility. Maybe we should find out. She whispered, her voice husky with something that made his blood sing in his veins. But before either of them could move, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the canyon, multiple riders moving fast and with deadly purpose. The sound seemed to come from everywhere, at once bouncing off the stone walls until it was impossible to tell which direction the riders were coming from. Ayana's expression instantly hardened, the moment of vulnerability vanishing like smoke. Every line of her body went taut with alertness, her hand moving instinctively to the knife at her belt. "You need to leave," she said, her voice suddenly cold and distant. "Now." "Who are they?" Gideon whispered, his blood turning to ice at the urgency in her voice. "The men who would rather see me dead than breathing," she replied, her obsidian eyes scanning the canyon walls for escape routes. "And they wouldn't hesitate to kill you for being with me." The word "with" hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made Gideon's heart race even faster. Were they together? Was that what this strange, electric connection was becoming? "I'm not leaving you to face them alone," he said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. Ayana's eyes widened slightly, as if she couldn't quite believe what she had heard. "You barely survived 3 drunken fools, and now you want to face trained killers. I want to protect you." The words were out before he could stop them, and immediately he felt foolish. What protection could he possibly offer this warrior goddess who had just saved his life? He was a surveyor, not a soldier. He carried instruments, not weapons. He measured land, he didn't fight for it. But something in his declaration seemed to touch her, because her expression softened almost imperceptibly. For just a moment, the mask of the hardened warrior slipped, and he saw the woman beneath lonely, tired, and perhaps more vulnerable than she wanted to admit. "Brave heart in a small package," she murmured. This time small sounded like an endearment rather than a dismissal. The hoofbeats were close now, maybe 50 yards away, and closing fast. The sound echoed off the canyon walls with increasing urgency, and Gideon could make out individual voices calling to each other in what sounded like military commands. Ayana grabbed his hand and pulled him toward a narrow crevice in the canyon wall. Her palm was warm and strong against his, and even in their desperate situation, the contact sent lightning up his arm and straight to his heart. They squeezed into the hiding spot just as 5 riders rounded the bend, their horses lathered with sweat and foam from hard riding. Gideon pressed his back against the cold stone, acutely aware of Ayana's body heat beside him in the cramped space. Her shoulder pressed against his chest, her hair tickled his cheek, and he could feel her controlled breathing against his neck. The intimate proximity in such a dangerous moment made his head spin and his heart race for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. The men who entered the canyon were nothing like the crude drifters from before. These rode with military precision, their weapons clean and well-maintained, their eyes scanning every shadow with the methodical thoroughness of professional hunters. They moved as a unit, covering each other's blind spots with practiced efficiency. Their leader, a weathered man, with a cavalry mustache and cold blue eyes that had seen too much killing, dismounted and examined the ground where the earlier fight had taken place. His movements were deliberate, controlled the actions of a man who had spent years tracking prey through hostile territory. "Fresh tracks," he called to his men, his voice carrying the authority of long command. The Apache woman was here, and she wasn't alone. Gideon's pulse hammered so loudly he was certain it would give them away. The sound seemed to echo in his ears like thunder, and he was amazed that the soldiers couldn't hear it. Beside him, Ayana's hand found his in the darkness and squeezed gently, a gesture that was somehow both reassuring and unbearably intimate. "She's getting bolder," another rider observed, spitting into the dust. "Attacking white men in broad daylight. Or protecting someone." The leader replied thoughtfully, his gaze sweeping the canyon walls with predatory patience. "Search every crevice, every shadow. She's still here. I can feel it." Ayana's grip on Gideon's hand tightened until her knuckles went white. In the dim light filtering into their hiding place, he could see her jaw clench with barely controlled fury. These men weren't just hunting her. They were enjoying it, savoring the chase like hounds pursuing a fox. As the soldiers began their systematic search, moving closer to their hiding spot, with each passing heartbeat, Ayana leaned close to Gideon's ear. Her lips barely brushed his skin as she whispered, and the contact sent shivers down his spine, despite the dire circumstances. "When I move, you run." She breathed her words so quiet they were almost lost in the whisper of wind through stone. "No matter what happens to me, you run and don't look back." But Gideon was done running. Done being the small, weak man everyone expected him to be. An idea began to form in his mind, desperate and probably suicidal, but perhaps their only chance. The soldiers were methodical in their search, checking every shadow and crevice with practiced efficiency. Gideon could hear their boots scraping against stone, getting closer with each heartbeat. The sound seemed to fill the entire world, drowning out everything else. One of them was examining the rocky outcropping just 10 feet from their hiding place, his keen eyes missing nothing as he searched for any sign of their quarry. "Found something, Captain," the man called out. He had discovered the broken rifle pieces left from the earlier fight, and he held up the splintered wood with obvious interest. The captain examined the shattered weapon with the eye of an expert. "She's stronger than we thought. No ordinary woman breaks a rifle stock with her bare hands." "Maybe she ain't ordinary," another soldier muttered nervously, his voice carrying a superstitious edge. "Indians got their ways." "Shut your fool mouth." The captain snapped his voice, cutting through the desert air like a whip. "She bleeds red same as anyone, and when we find her, she'll hang same as anyone." Beside him, Ayana's breathing changed, becoming deeper and more controlled. Gideon recognized it as the breathing of someone preparing for battle, the way a cat coiled its muscles before striking. Her free hand moved to her knife, and he knew that in seconds she would burst from their hiding place like a force of nature. But she would be outnumbered 5-1. These weren't drunk drifters. They were trained killers with rifles and a clear tactical advantage. Even Ayana, with all her skill and strength, couldn't fight those odds and win. Without thinking, Gideon squeezed her hand and whispered directly into her ear, his breath warm against her skin. "Trust me." Before she could respond, he stepped out of the crevice with his hands raised, making his voice shake with carefully manufactured fear. "Don't shoot," he called out, letting genuine terror leak into his words. "I'm unarmed." The soldiers spun toward him, rifles raised and ready. The captain's eyes narrowed as he took in Gideon's small frame and civilian clothes, cataloging him as either a potential threat or a useful source of information. "Well, well," the captain said slowly, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a hunter who had found unexpected prey. "What do we have here? You see which way the Apache woman went, son." Gideon nodded eagerly, playing the part of a terrified witness to perfection. His years of careful observation as a surveyor served him well. Now he had learned to read people as well as landscapes, to notice the small details that revealed larger truths. "Yes, sir," he said, his voice trembling with what sounded like genuine fear. "She went that way." He pointed toward the northern pass with a shaking hand, moving fast like the devil himself was chasing her. "How long ago?" the captain asked, his pale eyes boring into Gideon's face, as if trying to read the truth written there. "Maybe 20 minutes, sir. She was alone and she looked wounded, bleeding from her left shoulder and favoring her right leg." The lie came easily to his lips, each detail carefully chosen to sound convincing. Gideon found himself surprised by how naturally deception flowed when lives hung in the balance. He was adding just enough specific detail to make the story believable without overdoing it. The captain studied him for a long moment, his experienced eyes probing for any sign of deception. "You didn't happen to see what direction this wounded Apache was traveling from, did you?" Gideon's mouth went dry. This was clearly a test, and the wrong answer could get them both killed. But his surveyor's mind had already cataloged the details of the canyon wind patterns, dust settlements, the angle of disturbed stones. "South, sir," he said without hesitation, his voice gaining confidence as he warmed to his role. "She came from the south, bleeding and moving erratic-like. Kept looking over her shoulder as if someone was chasing her. had the look of an animal that knows it's being hunted. The specific details hit their mark. The captain nodded slowly, apparently satisfied by the convincing nature of Gideon's testimony. "Smart man staying out of an Apache's way," he said approvingly. "You'd best head back to town before more of them show up. This territory isn't safe for decent folk." The soldiers mounted their horses and thundered away toward the northern pass, their dust cloud marking their retreat into the desert. Only when the sound of hoofbeats had completely faded into the distance did Ayanna emerge from the crevice. She moved toward him with that predatory grace he was beginning to recognize, her obsidian eyes unreadable in the afternoon light. For a moment, Gideon wondered if he had miscalculated, if she was angry at his interference. Then she was in front of him, so close he could feel her breath on his face, could see the flecks of amber in her dark eyes. That was either very brave or very stupid. She said quietly, her voice carrying a complexity of emotions he couldn't quite decipher. "Maybe both." Gideon admitted his heart still racing from the adrenaline coursing through his veins like liquid fire. Her eyes searched his face, and something shifted in her expression, a recognition perhaps of something she hadn't expected to find in this small, unlikely man. "I think I'm beginning to understand you, Gideon Nash," she said, his name rolling off her tongue like honey mixed with smoke. Before he could respond, she pressed her palm flat against his chest, right over his hammering heart. The contact sent electricity racing through his entire body, making every nerve ending sing with awareness. "So tell me again." She whispered, her voice husky with desire and something deeper, more complex. "What happens if you touch me?" The question hung between them like a loaded gun, heavy with possibility and danger. This time, Gideon didn't hesitate. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm tired of wondering." Slowly, as if approaching a wild animal that might bolt or attack, he raised his hand and traced the line of her jaw with his fingertips. Her skin was incredibly soft, a stark contrast to the steel-hard muscles beneath. The contradiction fascinated him, this woman who could kill with her bare hands, trembling at his gentle touch. Ayanna's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes fluttered closed for just a moment before snapping open again, as if she had caught herself in a moment of unexpected vulnerability. "Your skin," Gideon murmured, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone with reverent gentleness. "It's like silk stretched over granite. You're the first man brave enough to find out." She replied, her voice thick with emotion he couldn't quite identify. "Or stupid enough. Maybe there's no difference." Gideon's hand slid into her hair, the black strands like liquid midnight between his fingers. She leaned into his touch, and for a heartbeat, the fierce warrior disappeared, replaced by a woman who looked almost fragile in her need for gentleness. "This is dangerous," she warned him, though she made no move to pull away from his caress. "For both of us. My people would kill you if they found out. Your people would hang us both. I don't care about my people or yours," Gideon said with fierce conviction that surprised them both. "I care about this moment, about the way you look at me, like I actually matter in this world." Ayanna's eyes widened at the intensity in his voice, at the raw honesty of his words. "You should care. You should run as far from me as you can and never look back." Instead, Gideon stepped closer, eliminating the last few inches between them until he could feel the heat radiating from her body. "What if I'm tired of running? What if I want to stay and see what happens when two people choose each other over fear?" But before she could answer, the distant sound of voices echoed through the canyon. Male voices calling her name, but not in English. Apache voices growing closer with each passing second, carrying the authority of command and the promise of violence. Ayanna's entire body went rigid with tension, every muscle coiling like a spring ready to release. "My brother," she whispered, her face going pale beneath her bronze skin. "He's found me." The Apache voices grew louder, accompanied by the sound of unshod horses moving through the canyon with practiced stealth. These weren't the heavy, thundering hoofbeats of cavalry horses, but the whisper-quiet movement of animals trained for war. Ayanna immediately stepped away from Gideon, but not before he saw something that looked almost like fear flash across her features. Not fear of physical danger, but something deeper and more complex. "Hide," she commanded, her voice suddenly cold and distant, the warrior mask sliding back into place. "If they see you with me." "No." Gideon interrupted, his voice steady and sure. "I'm done hiding." "You don't understand," she said, desperation creeping into her voice. "My brother Takakota leads our war party. He has sworn to kill any white man who touches Apache women. It's a blood oath he's kept many times before." Has he kept that promise before? The dark look that crossed her face was answer enough. Gideon felt his stomach turn, but he didn't back down. "Then why are you here alone? Why aren't you with them?" Ayanna's jaw tightened with old pain, with wounds that had never properly healed. "Because I refuse to be their weapon anymore. They want me to seduce white soldiers, learn their secrets, then watch as my brother cuts their throats in the night. They want me to be a spider in their web of death." The revelation hit Gideon like a physical blow. The pieces of her story began clicking into place: her skill in combat, her knowledge of English, the way the cavalry had been hunting her specifically. She wasn't just a warrior. She was an assassin, a spy who had turned her back on everything she had ever known. "How many?" he asked quietly, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "Too many." Her voice was barely audible, heavy with the weight of accumulated guilt. "Men who trusted me, who thought I cared for them. Good men and bad men alike. After a while, it stopped mattering which was which. Understanding dawned on Gideon like sunrise over the desert. The soldiers earlier, they weren't just hunting any Apache. They were hunting you specifically. I killed their captain's brother," she said, closing her eyes, as if trying to block out a memory too painful to bear. He was not a good man. But his death started a war between my people and the cavalry. Blood for blood endlessly, until the desert runs red with it. The Apache voices were closer now, maybe 200 yards away. Gideon could make out individual words, though he didn't understand their meaning. The tone was urgent, searching, tinged with the authority of command and barely restrained anger. "So you're caught between two armies," he said quietly, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. "Your own people who want to use you as a weapon, and the white soldiers who want to hang you for defending yourself. Now you understand why touching me is dangerous," she said, her voice heavy with resignation. "Why you should run while you still can, while there's still time to save yourself." Instead, Gideon reached for her hand. This time she didn't pull away, but her fingers were tense in his grasp, trembling with barely controlled emotion. "What if there was a third option?" he asked. "There is no third option," she replied. But there was less conviction in her voice now. "This is how the world works. This is how it's always worked. The world is bigger than this canyon, bigger than this territory," Gideon said with growing conviction. "Bigger than the hate between our peoples." Ayanna stared at him as if he had spoken in a foreign language, as if the concept he was suggesting was literally incomprehensible to her. "You're talking about running away together," she said finally. "I'm talking about choosing our own path instead of letting others choose it for us. I'm talking about writing our own story instead of letting other people write it for us." For a moment, hope flickered in her obsidian eyes like a candle flame in the wind. Then reality crashed back down, and she shook her head with sad finality. "You don't know what you're asking," she said. "I've done terrible things, Gideon. Things that would make you sick if you knew the details. things that would make you run screaming into the desert. I don't care about your past, he said firmly. I care about who you choose to be from this moment forward. You would care, she insisted. You should care. The Apache voices were now close enough that Gideon could hear individual footsteps, 3 riders moving with the confidence of men on familiar ground men who knew every stone and shadow of this territory. Ayanna looked toward the sound, then back at Gideon, her expression carrying a weight of finality that made his blood run cold. If you truly want to touch me, little surveyor, she said softly, using the endearment that had somehow become precious to him, you'll have to prove you can protect me first. From them. 3 Apache warriors emerged from the canyon shadows like ghosts, given flesh their movements so fluid and silent that they seemed to materialize from the rock itself. They moved with the deadly grace of apex predators, their eyes scanning the canyon with professional thoroughness. The leader was unmistakably Ayanna's brother. He shared her height and predatory grace, the same obsidian eyes and proud bearing that spoke of generations of warriors. But where she radiated controlled power, he blazed with barely contained fury that made the air around him seem to vibrate with menace. Takakota was perhaps 30 years old, with ritual scars marking his chest and arms, telling the story of battles fought and enemies defeated. His long black hair was adorned with eagle feathers that marked his status as a war chief, and his buckskin clothing was decorated with intricate beadwork that spoke of his high rank within the tribe. His companions flanked him with the disciplined spacing of seasoned warriors, their hands resting casually on weapons that looked well used and deadly. These weren't young braves seeking glory. These were veteran killers who had survived countless battles through skill, cunning, and absolute ruthlessness. Takakota's dark eyes locked onto Gideon with the intensity of a predator who had found his prey cataloging every detail of the small white man with professional interest. Ayanna. Takakota called out in accented but perfect English, never taking his gaze off Gideon. Step away from the white man. No. She replied, simply moving to stand beside Gideon rather than behind him. The gesture was small but significant. She was choosing to stand with him rather than seeking his protection. Takakota's expression darkened like storm clouds gathering over the desert. You shame our family, our people, he said, his voice carrying the weight of deep disappointment. You consort with the enemy, while our brothers die in white man's wars. Our brothers die because you choose war over wisdom. Ayanna shot back her voice, carrying the weight of old arguments and older pain. Because you refuse to see any path except the one that leads to more bloodshed. There is no path for Apache women who betray their blood, Takakota said with cold finality. Gideon felt the weight of 3 pairs of hostile eyes boring into him like spear points. These weren't the clumsy drifters from earlier or even the disciplined cavalry. These were apex predators in their natural element, and he was hopelessly outmatched in every conceivable way. But Ayanna had challenged him to prove he could protect her, and running now would prove the opposite. More than that, it would confirm every assumption these warriors had about white men, that they were cowards who abandoned those who depended on them when the stakes became too high. She's not betraying anyone, Gideon said, stepping forward despite every survival instinct screaming at him to retreat. She's choosing peace over endless killing. Takakota's hand moved to the war club at his belt, and the gesture casual but unmistakably threatening. Small man speaks big words. Sometimes big words from a small heart carry more weight than small words from a big one. Gideon replied, surprised by his own steadiness in the face of almost certain death. One of the other warriors snorted with amusement, earning a sharp look from Takakota. But Gideon pressed his advantage, addressing all 3 men with the same careful authority he had used to deceive the cavalry. You hunt your own sister like an animal, he said, letting disappointment color his voice. Where I come from, men protect their women. They don't pursue them with weapons drawn. Where you come from?" Takakota snarled, his carefully controlled demeanor slipping for the first time. Men steal land and break promises like twigs in the wind. Where you come from, men speak of peace while preparing for war. "You're right," Gideon admitted, and the unexpected agreement seemed to catch them off guard. "My people have done terrible things to yours. Broken treaties, stolen land, killed innocents. But I'm not my people, just like your sister doesn't have to be defined by yours." Takakota studied him with calculating eyes that missed nothing, the way Gideon stood, the set of his shoulders, the tremor in his hands that he was trying so hard to control. "You think your pretty words will save you, surveyor?" he asked, and there was something almost like respect in his voice. Gideon's blood chilled. They knew who he was, what he did for a living. This wasn't a chance encounter. "You've been following me," he realized. "Following the man who maps our sacred places for the Iron Snake." Takakota confirmed his voice, dripping with contempt. "The man who draws lines where none should exist, who helps the white soldiers plan their attacks on our villages. He maps land, and I have killed white soldiers," Ayana said quietly, stepping closer to Gideon until her shoulder brushed his. "Does that make us even, or must we both pay for our people's sins forever?" For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Takakota's proud features. Gideon sensed this was the moment that would determine everything, not just his fate, but Ayana's future, and perhaps the path forward for all of them. "I'll make you a deal," Gideon said, his voice carrying across the canyon with surprising authority. "You presume to bargain with us?" one of the other warriors asked incredulously. "Single combat." Gideon continued, ignoring the interruption. "If I win you, let her choose her own path. If you win," he spread his hands in a gesture of acceptance, "you won't have to worry about me anymore." Takakota's smile was sharp as a blade and twice as dangerous. "You would fight me, little surveyor? You would die for someone you barely know?" "I would die for her," Gideon said simply, and the quiet conviction in his voice seemed to resonate in the canyon air. Because sometimes dying for something is the only way to prove you're truly alive. The words hung in the air like a sacred oath, and something shifted in the atmosphere. Even the other warriors looked surprised by the quiet dignity in Gideon's voice, by the absence of bravado or false heroics. Takakota began to circle him like a wolf sizing up wounded prey. The Apache warrior was everything Gideon wasn't: tall, powerful, bred for combat from childhood. His muscles rippled beneath bronze skin, marked with the scars of countless battles. In a fair fight, Gideon would be dead within seconds. But Gideon had no intention of fighting fair. "You know what your sister sees in me?" Gideon asked as Takakota approached with his war club raised, testing its weight with practiced ease. "Weakness," Takakota replied contemptuously. "The same thing you're too proud to see." Gideon continued calmly, his voice carrying across the canyon with surprising clarity. "That sometimes the strongest choice is knowing when not to fight." Takakota's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You speak in riddles like a coward preparing to die." "I speak like a man who understands that victory isn't always about who can hit hardest," Gideon replied. "Sometimes it's about who can think fastest." The war chief raised his club muscles, coiling for a strike that would shatter bone and end the conversation permanently. But instead of cowering or attempting a futile defense, Gideon did something completely unexpected. He smiled. "Your sister told me about the soldiers who were hunting her," he said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather instead of his imminent death. "Did you know I sent them north while she was hiding right here? Did you know they'll be back when they don't find her trail?" Takakota hesitated, his club still raised, but his expression shifting from confidence to uncertainty. "Did you know?" Gideon continued, his voice gaining strength and authority. "That the cavalry captain leading them is the brother of the soldier your sister killed. That he won't stop hunting her until one of them is dead." "You lie," Takakota said, but there was less conviction in his voice now. I'm a surveyor. Gideon replied calmly, letting his professional authority seep into his words. I make my living by observing details others miss. The captain's name is Morrison. He has a scar on his left hand from an old knife wound. He rides a bay gelding with a white blaze. He's not interested in justice, he wants revenge, pure and simple. The specific details hit their mark like arrows, finding their target. Takakota's war club lowered slightly as he processed the information, his warrior's instincts recognizing the ring of truth in Gideon's words. Why tell me this? He asked suspiciously. Because your sister is caught between two forces that want to destroy her, and you're making it worse by forcing her to choose sides, Gideon said with growing conviction. But there's another way forward if you're brave enough to take it. What other way? Gideon took a deep breath, knowing his next words would either save them all or get him killed. We stop running from each other and start running towards something better. Speak plainly. The railroad I survey for it brings soldiers, yes, but it also brings law. Federal marshals who answer to Washington, not local commanders with personal vendettas. It brings witnesses, journalists, people who make it harder for both sides to commit atrocities in secret. Takakota's eyes narrowed, but he was listening now rather than preparing to strike. Continue. Your sister could be a bridge between our peoples, instead of a weapon for either side. Gideon continued his words, gaining momentum and passion. She speaks both languages, understands both cultures. She could help negotiate peace instead of perpetuating war. And you? Takakota asked. What do you gain from this? Gideon looked at Ayanna, unseeing hope flickering in her dark eyes like starlight in the desert night. I gain the chance to build something instead of just measuring what others destroy. I gain the chance to be part of something larger than myself. For a long moment the canyon was silent, except for the whisper of wind through stone. Takakota studied Gideon with the intensity of a hunter evaluating prey. But there was something else in his gaze now, a grudging respect for the small man's courage, if not his wisdom. You speak of peace while your people prepare for war, he said finally. Some of my people, Gideon corrected. Just as some of your people choose war while others might choose differently if given the chance. Takakota slowly lowered his war club completely, his expression thoughtful. You are either very wise or very foolish, surveyor. Maybe both, Gideon admitted. But I'm tired of being afraid all the time. Tired of living in a world where the only choices are kill or be killed. The war chief looked at his sister, and for the first time, Gideon saw the family resemblance in their expressions, the same proud bearing, the same fierce intelligence, the same deep capacity for both love and violence. Sister, Takakota said in Apache, his tone gentler now, and the musical flow of the ancient language seemed to fill the canyon with unexpected beauty. Ayanna responded in the same language, her words flowing like water over stone. Whatever she said made Takakota's expression soften further, and Gideon caught glimpses of the man beneath the warrior, someone who loved his sister deeply despite their differences. The conversation continued for several minutes, voices rising and falling with emotion. Finally, Takakota turned back to Gideon. She says you are brave enough to be worth protecting and foolish enough to need it, he said, and there might have been the faintest hint of amusement in his voice. That sounds about right, Gideon admitted. Takakota stepped closer, and for a moment, Gideon thought the war chief might strike him down, after all. Instead, the Apache warrior extended his hand in a gesture that transcended cultural boundaries. If you betray her trust, Takakota said quietly as they clasped hands, I will find you. Distance means nothing. Time means nothing. I will find you and make you pay for that betrayal. I understand, Gideon replied, meeting the war chief's gaze steadily. And if I ever do anything to hurt her, You'll have my permission to make it slow." Something that might have been approval flickered in Takakota's eyes. He turned to Ayana and spoke rapidly in Apache, his words carrying the weight of finality. She nodded once, then stepped forward and embraced her brother fiercely. When they separated, there were tears in both their eyes, the first display of vulnerability Gideon had seen from either of them. Takakota mounted his horse with fluid grace, his companions following suit. "Choose wisely, sister," he said in English, then looked at Gideon. "Both of you. The world is changing, and those who cannot change with it will be swept away." The three warriors disappeared as quietly as they had arrived, leaving Gideon and Ayana alone in the gathering dusk. The canyon walls glowed red and gold in the setting sun, and the air was finally beginning to cool after the oppressive heat of the day. Gideon's hands shook as the adrenaline finally began to wear off, leaving him feeling hollow and exhausted. But when he looked at Ayana, he saw something in her expression that made his heart race all over again. Not with fear this time, but with possibility. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen a man do," she said quietly. "It was the most terrifying thing I've ever done." Gideon admitted, his voice still shaky from the encounter. "Courage isn't the absence of fear," she replied, stepping closer until he could smell the sage and wood smoke in her hair. "It's acting despite the fear, choosing to do what's right, even when it might cost you everything." She reached out and touched his cheek, her palm warm against his skin. The simple contact sent electricity racing through his entire body, making every nerve ending sing with awareness. "You asked me what would happen if you touched me," she said, her voice husky with emotion. "Now I have a question for you. What happens when I touch you?" Before he could answer, her lips found his in a kiss that tasted of freedom and possibility, and the promise of tomorrow. Her arms encircled him, pulling him against her powerful frame. And for the first time in his life, Gideon felt truly safe, not because there was no danger, but because he had found someone worth facing danger for. The kiss deepened, and Gideon felt the last of his reservations melt away. This woman, who could kill with her bare hands, was holding him with infinite gentleness, as if he were something precious that might break if handled carelessly. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ayana smiled, not the predatory grin he had seen before, but something softer and infinitely more dangerous to his heart. "So," she whispered against his ear, her breath warm against his skin. "Ready to see what happens when we touch each other?" 3 months later, the town of Esperanza, California gained 2 new residents who called themselves John and Anna Nash. The railroad surveyor and his wife seemed like any other couple seeking a fresh start in the growing territory, though those with sharp eyes might have noticed the way the tall, bronze-skinned woman moved with uncommon grace, or how the small, quiet man seemed to see details others missed. They built a modest house on the edge of town where the desert met the mountains and the sunsets painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. John continued his surveying work, but now his maps served a different purpose. They helped identify routes that would minimize disruption to Apache territory, while still serving the railroad's needs. Anna served as a translator and guide for travelers heading east, but her real work was far more important. Together, the couple had become unofficial mediators, helping to negotiate peaceful passage agreements between the railroad and various Apache bands. Their work wasn't glamorous or well publicized, but slowly, quietly, they began to build bridges where others had built walls. Anna's knowledge of both cultures and John's understanding of railroad politics made them uniquely qualified to find solutions that benefited everyone. They helped establish trading posts where Apache goods could be exchanged for manufactured items, reducing the economic pressures that often led to raiding. They worked with sympathetic officials to create safe corridors for Apache movement during seasonal migrations. Most importantly, they served as living proof that peace was possible between peoples who had been taught to see each other as enemies. In the evenings, when the desert air cooled and the mountains turned purple against the sunset sky, and they would sit on their porch and watch the world change around them. The railroad brought progress, yes, but also problems. Their job was to help ensure that progress didn't have to come at the cost of destroying everything that had come before. Do you ever regret it? Anna asked one evening, her head resting against Gideon's shoulder as they watched a train wind its way through the distant mountains like a mechanical snake. "Which part?" he replied, running his fingers through her unbraided hair, marveling, as he always did, at its silky texture. "Giving up your old life, taking a chance on someone like me." Gideon turned to look at her, seeing the woman who had saved his life in more ways than one. In the months since they had left the canyon, she had begun to heal from the wounds of her past, just as he had found the courage he never knew he possessed. "I didn't give up my old life," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "I traded a half-life of fear and loneliness for a full life of love and purpose." Anna smiled, the expression transforming her face from merely beautiful to luminous. "And what happens now, when we touch each other every day? Now we find out what happens when two people choose love over fear, hope over hatred," he said, pulling her closer and marveling, as he always did, at how perfectly they fit together, despite their obvious differences. "We find out what happens when we build something together instead of tearing things apart." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky above the California desert, Gideon reflected on the journey that had brought them here. It had begun with a simple question: "What happens if I touch you?" and had led to the discovery that sometimes the most unlikely pairs create the strongest bonds. The giant and the small man, who had been brave enough to ask the question, foolish enough to risk everything for the answer, and wise enough to build a life on the foundation of that answer. Their work continued to expand. They established a network of contacts throughout the territory, Apache leaders who trusted Anna's word, railroad officials who respected John's expertise, federal marshals who appreciated their efforts to maintain peace. Slowly but surely, they were weaving a web of cooperation that transcended the traditional boundaries of race and culture. When conflicts arose, as they inevitably did, John and Anna were often called upon to mediate. They had developed a reputation for fairness and wisdom that made both sides willing to listen to their proposals. They couldn't solve every problem, couldn't prevent every tragedy, but they made a difference where it mattered most. Their story became part of the legend of the American West, not the tales of gunfights and gold rushes that filled the newspapers, but the quieter, more profound story of two people who chose to see the humanity in each other across a divide that seemed impossible to bridge. They had children, eventually 2 daughters who grew up speaking both English and Apache, who learned to see the world through eyes unclouded by the prejudices of their parents' generation. The girls became bridges themselves, carrying their parents' message of understanding into a future where such messages would be desperately needed. And every night, when Anna held him close in their bed, overlooking the desert they both loved, Gideon Nash gave thanks for the day he had been brave enough to ask a dangerous question, and fortunate enough to find a woman courageous enough to help him discover the answer. Love, they had learned, was indeed stronger than fear, bigger than the hatred between peoples, and more enduring than the violence that had defined their separate pasts. Together, they had found something worth fighting for, not with weapons, but with hope, patience, and the radical belief that the future could be different from the past. Their legacy lived on long after they were gone, in the peace agreements they had helped negotiate, in the children they had raised to see beyond color and culture, in the simple but revolutionary idea that enemies could become lovers, that understanding could triumph over hatred, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon of all was the courage to ask a simple question: "What happens if I touch you?"